Mark Carney's an educated person and he's no fool, but he's completely untested in the electoral domain, and he obviously has contempt for it because he's willing to be prime minister and to act like a governing prime minister, despite the fact that he's never put his policies to test in front of the Canadian electorate, despite the fact that only 130,000 people have positioned him as prime minister, and despite the fact that he's apparently willing to deceive Canadians about being an outsider, which he most certainly is not, and with regards to his actual aims, which is net zero by 2050, and he's willing to claim the contrary because he's going to turn Canada into an industrial powerhouse. So that means he's either wrong about everything he's believed in the last 20 years, and radically so, or he's lying because he thinks the emergency justifies it, and maybe because he's after power. Now let's investigate that a little bit. So, is Carney primarily after power? Perhaps for the reasons that we just described, perhaps because he's using the reasons we just described, his concern for the future, to justify his grip on power. That's another alternative. Well, let's see how he's conducted himself. Well, he hasn't come clean to Canadians with regards to his true aim. It's like, is he a net zero advocate by 2050 or not? Well, we want to build Canada into an industrial powerhouse. It's like, which is it, buddy? Because you're not going to do both. You're not going to crisscross Canada with fossil fuel pipelines while aiming at net zero by 2050. You're not going to do that. And so you were either wrong, and so wrong that it's a miracle, or you're deceiving Canadians because you think the emergency justifies it. That's the stark reality of the situation. Now, what is the evidence that the more stark reality, for example, that Carney is deceiving Canadians, what's the evidence that that's the case? Okay, well, let's say that it wasn't the case and that he's playing a straight game. Well, so then you got to ask yourself, why did he parachute himself into power the way he did? And why has he claimed publicly that he's an outsider?
But let's say,
oh boy,
let's say, just throwing out a
look
wild
at you trying to preserve the relationship all of a sudden.
A wild hypothetical. Let's say the candidate wasn't part of the government. Let's say the candidate did have a lot of economic experience. Let's say the candidate did deal with crises. Let's say the candidate had a plan to deal with the challenges in the here and now.
You sneaky, you're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
He proclaimed that on American television on the Jon Stewart show in front of like millions of people, right? So that's an international claim. We'll give the devil his due a little bit more. Carney's actually learned. He saw what happened under Trudeau. He can see that the net zero pursuit is untenable, although he has not formally repudiated it one bit, and it's still written down in black and white in his values. But then what would he do? He'd call an election because he's duty bound, morally bound to call an election, and he would make the election long as he possibly could, because that way he could go door to door and he could meet the Canadian public and he could let them get to know who he is, and he could take questions, intrusive questions from the press without getting peevish and annoyed. And he would outline his new industrial vision, and he would say why he was wrong about net zero and about ESG. That's that presumption that there should be central planning to fill the gaps of the free market, and that he was wrong about DEI, and that's about everything that he believed, and that he didn't understand Canada's core values. And despite the fact that he was absolutely wrong about everything he believed, he's now the guy to lead the country into an industrial revolution. And he could take a couple of months to convince Canadians of that, or he could call a snap election, hoping that all of the noise around Donald Trump and his relatively foolish proclamations re Canada has given Carney an undeserved advantage, and he could shorten the election cycle so that Canadians can't figure out who the hell he is, and rely on the apparent validity of his resume to propel him into the seat of the prime ministership. And so what's he doing? Well, you can ask yourself that. It's like, did you know any of these things about Carney that I just described? And if you didn't know them, well, why didn't you know them? And well, part of the reason for that is, well, Carney hasn't told anyone, although he did write the book Values, but who's read that, right? But I read it, and I understood it, and I'm doing my best to explain to you what it meant. He's got the wrong idea about Canadian values, because we're not a fundamentally utopian, socialist, elitist, top-down, central planning society. We're a Western democracy. And the principles that Carney outlined as cardinal values of Canadians are not the cardinal values of Canadians. And it's an interesting thing for the bloody Liberals to do anyways, because under Trudeau, we heard nothing but the proclamation that Canada had no core set of values and that we were really a post-national state, and that insofar as we had any national identity at all, it was mostly that of genocidal, capitalist, patriarchal oppressors. And so I don't understand at all how the Liberals under Carney, who's certainly not an outsider, can be waving the flag of Canadian virtue at this point, while also proclaiming that they've got their finger on what the Canadian core values are, translated into DEI and ESG and net zero, which are radical, leftist, globalist, utopian, top-down, central planning dogmas that are incredibly expensive and truly ill-advised.